trade, commerce, military, and more. A tug of war over the waters of the Pacific Ocean. Whoever controls them controls the future.
So you really can't overstate what is at stake here.
In this special report, we delve into the waters of the Pacific to look at what happens if the Chinese regime gains the upper hand and how it impacts not just every American, but the world. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The preeminent Pacific power. That's the title the United States is used to holding. But now it could all be lost.
We would find ourselves actually defending America from Hawaii. And if you play that out a little more, you're actually defending America from a lot closer to the U.S. West Coast.
That's Grant Newsham, retired Marine colonel and director of One Korea Network. He notes that it took many bloody battles in World War II to cement that title.
As hard as that is to believe, particularly for somebody who's sort of growing up after World War II, but we've had the upper hand where really Asia, the Pacific has been ours. We would finally face an enemy, face a situation where we would be on the defensive and from much closer to American territory. And this would have a way of playing out in other parts of the world as well.
But control of these waters doesn't just have strategic implications. Alex Gray, senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council, points out.
If we've learned anything from the post-COVID supply chain disruptions, it's just how critical U.S. economic and commercial traffic from Asia to the West Coast and from the West Coast distributed throughout the United States really is. We continue to be reliant in so many ways on trade and commerce coming from not just China, but from Southeast Asia and from India. And so much of that is going to traverse through the Pacific and end up in West Coast ports.
Gray adds a big part of that has to do with our current economic model.
As long as that is our economic model, as long as we continue to have an economy that requires cheap imports to fuel our consumer spending habits, that's going to require a navy and a projection forces that can traverse the Pacific, keep the sea lanes open, and allow the engine of our economy to keep churning.
For now, the waters of the Pacific are the engine that drives our economy. That gives a lot of power to whoever controls those waters. Gray notes the one that has that power
has the ability to deny access or keep open access is going to play a major role in determining the commercial future of the wider Pacific. And that's what the Chinese partially want.
That ties into the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP's, goals of becoming the global hegemon. Gray notes when it comes to the Chinese regime,
they want to be a global power. Anyone who tells you that their ambitions are regional and they're confined to just their near seas, I think is not keeping up with the reality of where we are. The Chinese are building a fleet and are building a global presence with bases and access agreements that span the globe from Greece to the Middle East and everywhere in between, potentially on the Atlantic now.
As for what the CCP's goals mean for the U.S. and allies,
we need to understand this is a serious challenge to the American commercial and military presence that we've taken for granted, at least since the end of the Cold War, but really since 1945.
Newsham adds, to understand the Chinese regime's current goals, sometimes it's important to take a look at history.
There's a huge political significance to the Chinese inroads into the Pacific Islands, if you think about it, because these have been part of the map that has been historically really America's since World War II. And what does it say if China gets in, competes with us for influence, and ultimately drives us out, and you throw in the military capability that they can put in place there? It certainly looks like they're the country that's on the rise, and the Americans can't get their act together. And it's not just Americans who notice this, but everyone else in the region will notice it, and the world will notice it.
That means it's not just America that's at risk, but rather the world. Part of that risk is the shrinking global space as technology and weapons capability expand.
And so if we have a Chinese base or an access agreement in places like one of the Micronesian islands, or in a place like Vanuatu or Papua New Guinea or the Solomon Islands, you go down the list of places, there's going to be a significant danger to the ability of the United States to operate freely and independently in the Indo-Pacific. And that's a military threat, and it's an economic threat.
The U.S. has been taking steps to shore up defenses. Vice President Kamala Harris recently spoke to Pacific Island leaders via video call. The message, while the U.S. failed to look after the islands in the past, that's changing. The U.S. has opened up 2 new embassies in Kiribati and Tonga. VP Harris also requested that Congress triple the funds going to the Pacific Islands, to the tune of $600 million over the next decade. While experts agree those are good steps forward, they argue there's more that needs to be done to ensure the U.S. doesn't lose the Pacific to adversaries. Newsham says first up is attention.
Now there is more attention being paid to the Pacific Islands and to the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific in general, than there has been for a good long while. For about 20 years, America was distracted by Afghanistan, by Iraq, but now it's getting the attention it deserves. And that's the real significance of it. And also, there's a recognition that China really isn't our friend, although a lot of people haven't quite given up on the possibility that with just a little more effort, they might come to like us.
With the attention has come high-level visits. But Gray argues while that's a good first step, there needs to be more.
That's not the solution that I get the sense they think it is. That's a nice way of stopping the bleeding.
Newsham adds, on top of the attention, there needs to be presence.
Put simply, if you look at U.S. strategy and activities in the region, if you're not there, you're not interested. And there's been a tendency to think that if we just pitch up with a 3 or 4-star admiral or general, and he meets the president or the chief of the whatever the military they've got, and then they have a nice tea and they go away, that somehow has solidified our presence. That's not the case. The military does something similar where they're very active in the region, our military, and they go and they put on an exercise, show up somewhere, have a goodwill visit, and then they're gone.
That's because when there's a vacuum, it gets filled. If the U.S. isn't the one in the region, then who is?
Now, who is there all the time? It's the local Chinese businessmen, the Chinese shopkeepers, the Chinese diplomats who are there in numbers just about everywhere, and they're very clever. They are effective. So the presence is really what matters.
But as to why presence is so important, Newsham adds it's offering alternatives.
So much of what Chinese influence depends on is a vacuum. And by a vacuum, I mean there's nothing to challenge it. There's no alternative for many of these countries. And they will tell you that. You'll hear them sometimes say, look, we're not doing this by choice, but what other options do we have? And that's where the Americans and the free nations need to provide them with some options.
To make that a reality, Gray lays out 2 steps. Firstly,
there should be an American embassy in every Pacific island. We have embassies in every country in Africa, throughout Central Asia. We should have an embassy in every Pacific island.
Secondly, there's the COFA agreements. COFA stands for Compacts of Free Association. It's a deal the U.S. has with certain island nations, like the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands.
These are absolutely critical economically, diplomatically, and militarily. These are special relationship that we have with those 3 countries that allow us access militarily in exchange for some economic support and some political support. Those are all 3 of those are going to need to be renewed in the next year to 2 years.
But beyond that, there's still more that can be done. Gray says, for instance, expanding our partnerships in the region and having our National Guard play a bigger role.
The National Guard has partnerships with a number of militaries in the region. We should be expanding those as far as we possibly can. And we should not be outsourcing our relationship with individual islands to other countries. We love our Australian friends, we love our New Zealand friends, but we have to have individual bilateral relations with every country in the region.
Out of the 12 independent Pacific Island countries, the U.S. has embassies in less than half of them. Instead, the U.S. relies on allies like Australia and New Zealand to take care of the issue. Newsham notes,
we've got friends as well. We mentioned Taiwan, but the Japanese could be very useful in the region. They already are, but there's more they could do. The South Koreans, the Indians, be very effective, particularly on the economic front. The Australians as well. And getting these partners who have an interest in the region, who have a presence, who do things there, put it together in a systematic campaign plan, and that would be a very useful challenge to what the Chinese have going.
But if steps aren't taken to boost presence and defenses in the area, experts warn,
it's going to have a chilling effect across the Pacific Islands, and it's going to play right into the Chinese hand.
As Newsham notes,
but the presence really does matter.
One example that's played out is in the Solomon Islands. Gray notes,
we did not have an embassy for decades. We have only recently announced that we intend to bring an embassy back. That lack of presence and that decision decades ago to rely on Australia to represent the alliance position in the Solomons, I think has turned out to be a very dangerous decision, and hopefully we'll correct it.
That's because since then, the Chinese regime swooped in and made a security pact with the Solomon Islands.
If Solomon Islands ends up with a dual-use facility or a permanent base or some in-between hybrid model that gives the Chinese access, it's going to be the most devastating impact on the security of the first island chain going into the second island chain since World War II.
Why is that? Because for the Chinese regime, everything is what's known as dual use. There's a civilian use, but also a military use. So while one could argue the security pact is just for commercial use, it has darker shades of meaning too. Gray adds for those in the region,
will be the greatest threat to Australian national security since 1945. I don't think you can exaggerate how much of a danger it will be to the alliance structure that the United States has built, because, put simply, it's going to sit astride Australia's sea lines of communication. It's going to have, you look, it's a very short, several-hour flight from the Northern Territory of Australia to Honiara. There's a reason why thousands of Americans died in World War II fighting to keep Henderson Field on Guadalcanal operative, because the control of that island is absolutely critical for Australia's outlet to the wider world.
Another concern is with the Solomon Islands and other potential bases in the Pacific. The Chinese regime could sidestep the first and second island chains. The first island chain stretches from Japan to Taiwan down to the Philippines and Malaysia, effectively hemming in the Chinese regime from expanding out into the Pacific. The second island chain is in Oceania, the islands that stretch through Guam, Micronesia, down through Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, down towards Australia and New Zealand. Given the importance of these barriers, Gray notes,
the strategic rationale for why the Pacific Islands matter for the United States is relatively clear, and it's been consistent going back to the early years of American history. We fought multiple wars in the Pacific for this reason, and it's simple. If you want to get from the West Coast and from Hawaii, whether it's commercial, economic shipping, or it's military, you're going to have to transverse the Pacific Islands. You're going to have to go across the Central Pacific and the North Pacific. You're going to have to go through the Micronesian Islands. If you want to get to the Korean Peninsula, if you want to get to Taiwan, if you want to access the markets of Southeast Asia, if you want to resupply U.S. forces in Korea, all of that requires unimpeded air and sea access through areas that are within range today missile range and aircraft range of major Pacific islands.
With the historical significance of these waters, experts warn it's important now, more than ever, to make sure the waters stay free from the control of adversarial powers like the Chinese regime, and free so that those who pay the ultimate price in fighting for their freedom won't have died in vain. As experts note, at stake isn't just our military might, but also our economy and our very way of life. That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntt.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.